Hello, Dan. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Hi, Lorenz. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a real honor to have you. Your work operates at the intersection of so many disciplines and informs and inspires so many people. And I'd love to start just with this exploration of this word transformation because it means different things to different people. And here, obviously, we're in the Transformational Learning Summit. So I'd love to get your take on what does transformation mean?
Well, it's an interesting word, isn't it? Trans, to go across, and form, the shape of something, and ation, like an action item. So transformation for me involves all those elements of somehow moving from one, not just set of knowledge, but way of being into a more liberated way of awakening the mind. Um, so transformational learning for me is more than just acquiring some new skill or acquiring some new ways of um, having knowledge applied, but actually a new way of actually being in the world.
Hmm. One of the things that touched me about the talk that you gave in Stockholm, where I met you a few months ago, was the way that you expanded on this, on the territory between me and this broader sense of self. And I get the sense that part of maybe one of the most significant transformations that a person goes through is the transformation of what or who they consider themselves to be.
Yeah, well, it's yeah, exactly. We come from a very interesting evolutionary history, don't we, of being human beings and also being mammals and also being animals with a backbone and also being just living creatures. So we've got literally hundreds of millions of years of evolution that underlie what you're asking about our identity. So at the simplest, we can say we exist like anything else that exists in the universe. But then we could say, yeah, but we exist as living beings. And then you can go on and on all the way down to our human family. And then you're born into this humanity as a particular body. So now we're getting very specific. And this body gets to live, about 100 years if we're fortunate. Um, and then you can say, well, who are you? Why are you here? What's the purpose of this bodily incarnation you have from all the potentialities that could have been? You could have been a star, you could have been, a daffodil, but no, you are Lorenz. So what are you going to do? As uh, Oliver tells us, what are you going to do with this one magical wild life, as she says, and in some ways, transformational learning, I think, invites you to start with exactly where you're starting, and about who are you, and what's your purpose of being here, and so all of that comes from your sense of self and identity, and we can talk more about that. But yeah, I totally agree that transformation is really at the depth of questions of existence and who are you
Mhm.
and why are you here. Yeah, and we can get into, how you would define that, how you would then say, well, if you are who you are, what's there to transform? But it is, like you're suggesting, it is the way your mind, which we can define in a moment, the way your mind is actually wrestling with these issues of identity that makes a huge difference in how you both live your life in terms of actions, but then how you experience your life in terms of subjective sensations that arise in the course of this existence. So yeah, so there's a lot to say about all that. That's
Mm.
that's a positive response to your question. Yes, I agree. It starts there.
I'd love to expand a little bit more on this territory, the relationship between the self concept a person might have and what learning means. Because I have this theory that so much of the way that we show up in the world is formed through the way that we learn, through the way that we learn to be with other people in our early childhood learning experiences. And so much of that also reinforces our self-concept of who we understand ourselves to be. And so this
Hmm.
feels something that is at the heart of um, anything going on in the world. Everything going on in the world is kind of a product of how people learned and then learned to be and then are with each other. So I'd love to like expand a little bit on any thoughts or reflections you have on this territory between the way that we see who we understand ourselves to be and what learning means.
Yeah. Well, I think if you consider the word self to mean like a center of experience, rather than just starting with the usual way we do in Western societies, in our modern culture, we say, well, the self is the individual. So if you say, well, hold on, if self is a word we mean for a center of experience, then you can see that how you see where that center has its boundaries makes all the difference in how you're going to learn. So, for example, if you say, well, myself is only this body called Dan, right? ABCD, a body called Dan. And if I'm just ABCD, maybe in this camera, you see this body, uh, I'm going to act a certain way. Maybe I'll say, oh, I need to get a lot of toys, or I need to get money to buy the toys, or I need to have everyone think of this body called Dan in a certain way. Or if it's all about my individuality as my full identity, of course, it's always a part of our identity, but if it's the full identity, a solo self, that myself is only in the body, I'm going to live a life and interact with you in a way that's all about my self promotion, with the word self meaning individual, right? But if instead I realize I have a lens that, like, just like a camera, I can focus on the details of a flower and get all into the petals and the stem and all the aspects of this flower. But I can also back up and see the whole rose bush, and I can even back out the lens and see the whole garden, and even back out the lens even further and see the garden as it's situated in a community, and then back out even further and see the community within a larger, you know political thing we call a state or a country, and then back out even further and see the whole biosphere. So it's really possible to have this identity lens be adjusted so that your feeling of where this self is and isn't. And that's one way that we as creatures have grown up, is determining what's me and what's not me. Um, but you can, as a human being, you can learn to adjust that lens. So then you start living in a different way. You feel in a different way. You have a perspective that's different, and you act on behalf of a much larger whole. And the research is really pretty, convincing that the more we can expand beyond just a singular view of self as only the individual, the healthier our own personal life will be, the healthier relationships with other people and with all of nature will be, then the overall greater good will be enhanced when we can expand this through things like meditative practices, or going for all walks, or developing gratitude, or building skills of compassion. Those are three emotions that we used to call self-transcendent emotions, but I think they're really self-extending or self-expanding emotions, um, that allow us to really adjust this identity lens. So for me, the word transformational learning begins with teaching the skill of realizing you have an identity lens, and then learning how to adjust it. Because sometimes you need to take care of your body. You need to exercise your body or
Mm.
nurture your body. You need to enjoy your body. You need to stretch your body. You need to make sure your body is getting enough sleep. So it's not that we're denying there's a bodily individual self, and the fact that that individuality is really important. And at the same time, we're saying, if identity constructed by the mind is only in the body, which is the lie of modern culture, then we're going to have a huge amount of suffering created by that distorted view of a self only being the individual. And so transformational learning, I think, begins with the simple skill of realizing identity is constructed. You have a lens that will help you realize you have different layers of identity. And so let's give you that natural skill that indigenous cultures have known for thousands of years, that contemplative cultures have known for thousands of years. But in modern times, and even modern science and modern medicine, we've, I think, fallen into the trap of seeing self as just the individual. And so, that's for me what transformational learning
Hmm.
begins with that. It doesn't end with that, but it begins with that.
Do you think there's a like what's the spectrum of this shift of self-concept as far as you can tell me about it and I'm like, oh, that's cool, I get the idea that I exist in relationship to other people, and so there's this, where do I begin and everything else begin, where do I end and everything else begins, and then there's some sort of deepening realization of it, and I wonder if that's something that first you might agree or disagree with, or it might somehow expand on the because part of what we're talking about is, I guess, relearning what I consider myself to be, and there's, in my experience, that there's the conceptual introduction of that, and then there's the kind of broadening experience of that as a direct felt sense in a way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think it's beautifully said, Lorenz. And it's so interesting. If you would have talked to me about this kind of thing like 30 years ago, uh, let's say when I was first training to be a therapist or something, in the field of mental health in the United States, at least, there was this whole thing about self-actualization, self-development, and self-regulation, and self-discovery, and self-improvement, all this self stuff. And it didn't do much good for the world. Let's just put it that way. It was really maybe well intended, but really misled.
Mm,
And so I was being raised as a young clinician uh, with the idea that being a psychotherapist meant the psyche, the mind of the individual was, what you're trying to work with. And, it's a long story, but in my own journey, you know, when I first was trying to understand how attachment relationships shape that self of the child, it really started becoming clear that relationships were an incredible source of our well-being, of how we develop resilience, how we develop self-understanding, how we develop this kind of exuberance in life, or the opposite of all those things. And so then to me, the question was, well, if relationships are that important in the development of the self of the child, what is the self really made of that it could be so dependent on something that is a relationality? It's like a not just a field of love, but a field of being understood and seen and connected and soothed and safe and all these things. So anyway, for my own journey as a someone thinking about these things and then ultimately writing about it and teaching about it, relationships were not like icing on the cake. They weren't even the cake. It was like the main meal. So then it was like, wow, okay, so then maybe the issue is that in modern mental health world, we've de-emphasized the importance of relationality and instead have gotten very, in a very kind of concrete, I don't want to say simplistic because it's not very simple, but in a very limited way, let's use that word, said, oh, the mind of the person is in their body, or the mind of the person, is in their brain, as Hippocrates said 2,500 years ago. And William James, the father of modern psychology, reaffirmed that too in 1890. And then I started thinking, well, maybe that's actually wrong. Maybe the mind isn't just inside your head, even though brain scientists were kind of mad that I would say these things and even chase me down hallways sometimes literally saying, stop talking like that. You're reversing science. And, I'm trained as a scientist. So I said, you know, the anger that is exuding from your body now and coming towards this body is a part of both our mental experiences. So to say it's only in your head makes no scientific sense.
Mm.
There's a relational field that joins us all. And Michael Faraday was mocked for proposing there were these electromagnetic fields that actually now all of our electronics are based on them. So even though you can't see something with your eye, it doesn't mean that it's not real. Now, not everything we imagine is real, so not everything that's invisible is true, but a lot of what's true we can't see with our eyes. And so when we talk about relational fields, it's helpful to stay with Faraday and just say, well, energy flows in all sorts of fascinating ways. One of them is as fields, in terms of electrical energy, but it also flows in ways that are degrees of probability that we can get into. And when you start really spending time with the experts in energy, physicists, even though they don't study the mind, you know, for me as a thinker in this area, seeing mind as using a term from the 1980s, when mathematicians got together to study complex systems, they came up with this wonderful word emergence, which in many ways is parallel to the similar word synergy. Something is greater than the individual parts. In the interaction of those parts, something emerges. So that's called emergent. Now, a linear scientist would say there's no such thing as emergence, there's only the parts. And if you say emergence, I've even seen one revered scientist called it emergence schmergence, just mocking the idea. But the mathematicians are pretty clear, and in biology, we see this all the time, that you see the interaction of something give rise to a property. For example, like the wetness of water is not found in any single H2O molecule. It's found in the H2O molecules interacting with each other, and the property of wetness arises, it emerges. Anyway, I had written years ago that the mind might be an emergent property of energy flow that is both inside your whole body, including the brain and your head, and within the relational fields that connect us all to other people and to all of nature. And so in that sense, mind is broader than the brain and bigger even than the body. And if you then say, well, if your experience of self is a construction of the mind, and the mind is an emergent property of energy that is both embodied and relational, then naturally self could be, if it could transform this way, out of the lie of modern culture, to do what indigenous cultures have known forever, that who we are is not just these bodies, that we're related to generations, 7 generations from now, so that we can live this life of this body to be a good ancestor, because we are 7 generations from now. Or the Lorenzo say, in terms of experience, when I look at you on this, setup we have with screens and everything like that, you are me. I actually don't subjectively experience you as separate in the sense of completely distinct. Of course, you have your body, I have my body. But the feeling is there's almost like emergences of actuality from a common pool of possibility that is our common home. And that these are just, embodiments of possibility. And so the journey is to then try to have all these actualities bring, optimal ways of living. What does that mean? To tap into what feels like, and we can get into this, but, feels like the source of all this possibility has the quality that we as human beings put a linguistic term to, which is love. And when you allow that love to arise, and I'm not saying this in kind of, or I'm saying this as a scientist, when you allow that love to arise, kindness emerges, compassion emerges, a quality you can call integration, where you're honoring differences and promoting linkages, that arises. And then that's kind of the fundamental fuel that allows you, in the face of all the suffering we see on the earth right now, human created, we can say, well, how do we find the pathway of love in the face of all this anger and hostility and fury that exists? So it's not like everyone's all having this love fest, but what can keep you towards this awakened mind, this transformational learning you're asking us to look at, to me, is tapping into that source. And transformational learning without that is going to have a limitation, because it will be just building on a construction that is an illusion that the self is separate. So starting with the self and tapping into this source of, well, then what is energy arising from? We can talk more about, where these notions come from, but that's ultimately, I think, what that awakening transformational process is.
Mm. What I love that you use the word love, and I wonder if you have a definition for that, like a technical definition that you work with.
It's so interesting. I have this practice called the Wheel of Awareness, and I was doing it in therapy to integrate consciousness. Then I started doing it with my students who are therapists. They found it useful. Then I started doing workshops. And the reason I started feeling comfortable, because I was told as a therapist and as a physician not to use the word love, because it could be really mucky, because people might think you were talking about sex. So for the longest time, it was like a no, it's a forbidden term. But what happened with the Wheel of Awareness practice is I ended up doing with 50,000 people in person before the pandemic hit. And I would send a microphone around if people were up for sharing what they experienced. And not everybody felt this way, but those who took the microphone, the most common word people used in the practice. And the practice is basically distinguishing the knowns on this metaphoric rim of a wheel. And then the knowing of consciousness is represented in the hub. And people have this opportunity to move a singular spoke around to differentiate the different knowns, like energy flow from outside the body that we call the first five sensations, seeing, smelling, tasting, hearing, touch. Then you go inside the body and basically becoming open to the energy flow of the internal world, called interoception, feelings in your lungs, your heart, your intestines, things, muscles, bones, things like that. Then you go and explore mental life, like thoughts and emotions and stuff, which is probably up in the head brain. But then you open up to the larger relational world of your connections to people and the planet. But before you do that, you actually, in an advanced step, you take the singular spoke, and before you move into that relational field moment, or that segment of the fourth segment of the rim, you bend the spoke around into the hub. And when people did that, people who never meditated before in their lives, the most common word they would say, and there's a lot of words which I can share with you if you want, but the most common word was love. So all I can say in terms of a definition that you're asking for is that I'm basically quoting the empirical data from the Wheel of Awareness, that the most common linguistic term people use, translated across languages, is love for pure awareness.
Mm.
Now, so at the most basic, just to be a descriptor, I just say that term is the term people use for pure awareness. Now, if you say, well, how do you define love? I could, as a scientist, what I go is, and this is kind of a long line of reasoning, but in trying to figure out, well, what is the hub arising from? Why is the hub so different from the rim? Like, what's going on? Why do people who get into the hub feel not just love, but timelessness? They feel connected to everyone and everything. They feel at home. They feel peace. I'm just listening to this recording of teachings I did, years and years ago with my dear friend John O'Donohue. He opens up with this meditation, and he's talking about all these ways you can get back to what he calls the sanctuary of the soul. And, you can explore all these things. So for me, when you look at what quantum physicists say about energy being the movement from possibility to actuality, you get into this whole thing that in one book took me 100 pages to actually describe. It's going to be hard to just describe briefly here, but there is this, what Arthur Zion's emeritus quantum physicist professor calls the sea of potential, this quantum vacuum. In this graph, it looks like a plane, and all the possibilities are sitting there. So I just named it the plane of possibility. This plane of possibility is where all the diverse things that could arise are sitting as potentialities before they turn into actualities. And that mathematical space, in that sense, is the God. It's the generator of diversity, right? And at John's passing, 10 years later, we had a big celebration of his life. He was a Catholic priest. And I did all this wheel of awareness practice and said to everyone, well, that's the God. And I went, oh my God, because the second row is all filled with his classmates from, priest school or whatever it is, the seminary. And they were all Catholic priests. And I go, oh my God, I must have said blasphemy. They go, oh no, Dan, John would have loved that, and John always said there never should have been a divorce between science and spirituality. And so, when in various religions, people talk about love, or Rumi talks about love, or in the Wheel of Awareness practice, people talk about love. I think it's basically the fundamental fabric of the universe. Why? Because, and this is now my science mind speaking, I think we use the word love for the fundamental process of linkage. I've got a dog here. She loves everybody. She'll link with anybody. I've got, the experience of going to the store, and I can look at a person in the store and ask the clerk how she's doing. And I can feel love for her. And I hope she feels love for me, but not in a sexual thing. It's not like a purpose-driven, object-focused love. It's just a feeling like the miracle of being alive and the miracle of everything being fundamentally connected, which is basically another law of quantum physics, right? That in the large object world that Newton described 250 years ago, you have space-time separations of noun-like entities, and that realm is real. When you go to a red light, when you're driving your car, you want to stop your car. So in space and time, it doesn't occupy the same zone, as another car passing in the green light. You want to stop your car. That's cool. That's fine. That keeps your body, your Newtonian macro state, classical physics body safe. Yet our minds are not just trapped into these Newtonian manifestations. We know there's another realm that's been established. A bunch of physicists got the Nobel Prize for it last year, proving that these properties of the quantum realm are very different from Newtonian properties, and that there are no noun-like entities. They're just verb-like processes that are massively connected with one another. And there is no variable of time. There's no what's called arrow of time. That's a long discussion. But the bottom line is that realm, I think, is in the hub of that wheel. And amazingly, people describe in that realm the word love. I think it's, to be kind of reductionistic about it, I think for me as a scientist, when I say, why are they saying love? It really emerges as the linguistic term we try to express this beautiful, intimate feeling of linkage. And so when you go out in nature and you feel this awe and love, it's because you realize you are fundamentally, I call it intra-connected. You are intra-connected, not even interconnected, where that thing is there in your hair and you're connected, but more you are a part of the fabric of the whole. And that, I think the linguistic term we use for that is love.
By the way, the book where you spent 100 pages expanding on the plane of possibility, what's it called?
Well, there's the book Aware, and my daughter Maddie, she helped me do the drawings for it. Aware is the 100 pages. Then in Intraconnected, I use her drawings and just refer people back to that book. But so you get less pages, but that's also about this notion. And what's so interesting about it is, I've been asked sometimes to do these unusual things. I once took a bus ride with 50 religious leaders, and they had me do the Wheel of Awareness practice at our final destination, which is a place called Pandopopulus, which is a forest in Utah. And the forest ranger was there who had never meditated before. So he does the meditation along with all these 50 religious leaders. And when we come out of the meditation, including bending the spoke around in this one, he says, oh my God, he goes, this meditation is exactly what I want people to feel. And so we go, well, what do you mean? Why? They're just here in a forest. Why do you need to feel anything? He goes, because in the hub, you feel the love and connection to everything. And he goes, in this forest, when we went 6 inches beneath the surface of the soil, we found that these 48,000 independent quaking aspen trunks are really have one root ball. And when we did the test of the DNA, it's one tree.
Mm.
It's the largest and probably the oldest living organism on Earth. And it has the appearance of separation, but you just go beneath the soil and you find out it's actually manifestations of one essence. And he goes, and that's what I felt in the hub. And that's, so I do the wheel every day. So for me, in terms of like transformational, groundings, what's so helpful about that is if you make a practice like this or something like it that allows you to literally learn, you have an identity lens, which you do in the wheel. And then what you do is you have the experience of getting in the hub and awakening the mind to what John would have called the sanctuary of the soul, to that hub. And you do it every day so that if something happens, like, I'm in a speed trap and a cop is giving me a ticket, instead of yelling and screaming at him, oh, this is nonsense, I don't need a ticket, I just look at him and I go from that hub inside of me and I say, sorry, officer, I didn't mean to be going so fast. And he goes, oh, I'll lower it down and give you a less of a.
That would be nice.
But you
I,
look straight at him, and say that and feel
I,
that.
I think what you're sharing about the mind and about the nature of the self, I mean, it's profound. It kind of turns our Newtonian view of reality upside down, and the way that we learn is firmly situated in this Newtonian reality, versus in this reality first, just on a very practical level of noticing the knower, the source of your awareness, and then noticing the attributes of your experience, your emotions, your feelings, your senses, all the different threads of what comes up in the space of your awareness. Um, there's some sort of profound shift there in the way that you understand yourself and the world around you. And I think the other dimension I want to add here is the, I guess it's implicit in the wheel of awareness, but it's the relational dimension of doing that potentially with other people. Because the wheel of awareness, as I've heard it presented by you, is an individual practice, and of course it opens up a lot of relational space. But I think there's something really powerful in doing, coming to that space of that hub space in a collective space to then see what emerges. And I guess for me, when I think about this word transformational learning, because it's also an inquiry, like what is it, what exactly are we talking about here, transformational learning? But one of the things that I think it takes on that directionality is when you have a group of people in a space who are coming to this hub within themselves, this space of pure awareness, and then choosing to somehow collectively investigate reality or explore some sort of territory.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. I mean, I don't know how wonky you want me to get here in this setting. Um, uh, I could do a brief dip into the wonkiness of the 100 pages, and certainly there's a whole book interconnected that explores it, or not, whatever you want, Lorenz. You tell me, because it builds on exactly what you're saying. Where,
Yeah, let's touch on it.
just very briefly, and if you do look at aware or interconnected, you'll find these diagrams that Maddie Siegel, my wonderful artist daughter, who's also in her doctoral program for environmental science. So what you'll see in the diagram is the idea from physics that there's a sea of potential, or quantum vacuum in the diagram. Since it's a diagram, it's in 3 dimensions, so it looks like a plane, the bottom, is where all potentiality is sitting. So we call it the plane of possibility. So I was just writing in my next book, I'm writing up about a quantum physics retreat I had with Henry Stapp, who's one of the original quantum physics people who studied with the originators of it, and he's now 95. But he was at a meeting many years ago, and you know, Henry Stapp was able to really help us think through some of these issues about how the quantum realm has these properties that are, in many ways, are underneath even our Newtonian bodies, but you just don't see them. So it's almost like the Newtonian body and the Newtonian realm is kind of like day vision, but then when you get night vision and your rods and cones shift so that the cones which see color start to go away and the rods which can see subtle light can start to see things, stars, for example, that you just didn't see before. So learning to sense the quantum realm is that kind of shift into a kind of night vision, and so the science behind it, though, helps us see that energy flow is basically describing the probability position, which is a weird thing to initially get at. This is why it took 100 pages. The probability position of energy. So when energy is in maximal uncertainty, it's called near zero. Let's say there's a million words we could say, and I'm thinking of one of them. At this moment, your chance, Lorenz, of guessing is 1 out of a million. So that's very uncertain, right? Low probability you're going to guess 1 out of a million. So the probability space of that sea of potential is maximal uncertainty, right? So if I said, well, Pacific Ocean, now it goes up to a peak, which is 100%. And you heard me say Pacific Ocean. I know I said Pacific Ocean. We're sharing that actuality. It's way up there on this diagram as 100%. I said Pacific Ocean. But now if I say, well, there's 5 named oceans, I don't know which one I'm going to say, then we'd be up at what you call a plateau. And in this plateau, there are just 5 things: Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Arctic Ocean, Indian Ocean. I'm sure there was one other ocean I can't name. What would it be? Another ocean, the 5th ocean. And so in these oceans now, there are just 5 things sitting there. So what's your chance of guessing from that plateau? It's mm-hmm. 1 out of 5, right? So that's 20%. So when you would see on the diagram this plateau, you'd say, oh, I see. That's a higher probability. Your chance of guessing which it is much higher. 1 out of 5 or is 1 out of a million, right? So the certainty is much higher the higher you get towards a peak. Anyway, so simply, we have a plane where all the stuff that could be is sitting as a potential. We have plateaus, which are a subset of basically a filtering of which of those potentials, in this case of the ocean story, 5 of them, 5 a million are sitting there, but we still have uncertainty. It's just much less than down at the plane. And then you have a peak where there's no uncertainty. It's 100% certainty. So you go from 100% at a peak to near zero at the bottom, which is the plane. Okay, so when we say energy is the movement along this probability distribution curve, it goes between the lowest probability near zero, all the way up to maximal probability, which is 100%. And that's called a peak. Anything between a peak and the plane is called a plateau. Fine. Now, when people learn stuff like the self is just in the body, or you're Lorenz, or I'm Dan, that becomes a plateau that has associated with it a subset of all possibilities that begin to become constraining how we think, or how we feel, or how we remember, or how we interact with each other. So those plateaus, like if you're driving a car, it's not that they're bad. You want to be in your car, know that a red light has a meaning, stop. So you stop, you put your feet on the brakes, your Newtonian car, and another car passes by and you don't get into an accident. And that's a good thing. So we're not trying to put down skills you learn in the Newtonian world of having plateaus that tell you how to drive a car. That's all fine. What you want to do is not become a prisoner of those plateaus. You want to have them become a playground. And in the playfulness, we need to embrace that you have the skills that you can develop and the strength to move the probability position of your mind, which is an emergent property of energy flow. Energy flow means where you are on this graph. That's all it means. If I'm having a thought, it's up at a peak. If I'm thinking, it's a sub-peak value. If I'm in a certain state of mind or mood, or I have a belief system in that state of mind, that'd be more like a plateau. And then if I'm way down to open awareness, I'm in the plane of possibility. Now, what freaks people out and what makes transformational learning so challenging is that you're trained to be certain. You take a test. What's the answer on this test? Well, I'm certain it's A. No, it's B, it's C, whatever. You want to be certain. You're reinforced for certainty. No one gives you a good mark for saying, I just don't know. It's a curious question, but I have no idea what the answer is. When you go into this space of open awareness, you're dropping out of all that learning that certainty is good and uncertainty is bad. And so part of the challenge of transformational learning is to really embrace the beauty of uncertainty, the power of not knowing. Now, of course, you may say, well, isn't that like wisdom tradition teaching all the time? Isn't that what Rumi said? Yes, 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 yes. In fact, indigenous teachings, contemplative teachings, religious teachings, philosophy. I mean, there's a process called consilience, which is how does everything kind of fit together? This model I'm offering as this weird suggestion that pure awareness is maximal uncertainty because it's mapped onto this plane of possibility business. It matches every indigenous and contemplative teaching that people bring to me. They said, don't you want to learn about Hindu teaching? I say, sure, tell me. They say all this stuff. And I go, well, yeah, it matches with this. Or those 50 leaders on the bus. I gave them a little talk on this stuff. They go, that matches, this teaching, that teaching, this teaching, that whatever these warring religions were on the bus. I go, well, here's a way you guys could all come together. Or when I was at John O'Donoghue's Celebration of Life, it's so interesting. So that being said, consilience is an effort to find a common ground. And in this framework, which comes from this broader thing I work in called interpersonal neurobiology, we are really looking for the consilience that can bring everybody together. There are a lot of problems in this world that need our collective minds to work on. We don't need to be blowing each other up and killing each other because of these long cross-generational transmissions of trauma and rage that just divide us up. We need to find that common ground, which, based on what we talked about a few minutes ago, you can see the fuel of that is moving towards this quantum realm where, amazingly, when people actually feel it, they start feeling love. And if you read like Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind and this exploration of psychedelics, he starts the whole book out in the first paragraph with, it all comes down to people experience love. That's what they all have in common. And then if you go to the last two paragraphs of his book, it says, no one knows why this happens, but maybe someone should explore the quantum physics relationship to this, And so I sent him my book, before my book Aware came out, when his book came out just a few months later. So I sent him that, because the book Aware describes why Pollan found what he found. And people working in the psychedelic world with controlled studies show that people can get out of anxiety, depression, mild to moderate depression, trauma, facing the panic of dying. Those are exactly what the wheel of awareness has been shown to be good for in my own clinical practice, not a controlled study or anything, but I don't think that's a coincidence. I think what psychedelics do is they tap you into this massive place where uncertainty becomes comfortable and you allow all this new possibility to arise depending on the set and the setting, because it's not that it's doing one thing or the other. And the studies by Robin Carhart Harris would support this in his work called The Entropic Brain. The entropic brain hypothesis of psychedelics, is one theory about them, says that the brain is achieving maximal uncertainty. Well, that's exactly what the plane of possibility is. And Mamishi Jha, actually independent of psychedelic studies, just with studying the brain and consciousness, took this proposal that the plane of possibility is the origin of awareness, the awareness of consciousness, the knowing of consciousness. And she was able to find, using a very sophisticated computerized EEG, that yes, that's exactly the neural correlate of this open awareness is maximal uncertainty. And so
Mm.
that gets to, I just listened to the Holberg Prize discussion in Norway. Um, and, they're going back and forth about this and that. And if I were in the audience, I would have raised my hand and said, one thing that ties the three of you together is looking at the mind as an emergent property of energy, and consciousness is one aspect of the mind. But that when you look at what they were all discussing, you can check out their it was like a debate, but it wasn't really a debate, it was really a discussion. Um, you can see that one way of resolving some of the conflicts that seem to be arising about these theories of consciousness is looking at this view that the plane of possibility is the source of awareness. And then you can understand how it is possible, and this is worth studying, that our bodies, rather than constructing consciousness, are actually more like a conduit that allows something to flow through us. And so if you look at the entropic brain hypothesis, then what the psychedelics might be doing, or certainly walking in nature might be doing, or doing the wheel of awareness might be doing, is not making something happen, but rather letting something happen.
Mm.
And in that sense, when you see, deep sages, wisdom from all sorts of traditions say, the truth is in you. You already have this inside you. To me, what that is all about, because I've done the wheel with so many people who've never meditated before in their lives, who suddenly get this incredible experience in 25 minutes of unbelievable love and connection without any kind of psychedelics, without any kind of, 2 years alone in a cave meditating or something, because that plane of possibility is available to every human being. And it's just a matter of getting those plateaus out of the way that tell you, you better be certain. You better know the answer. You drop into that plane. And then when that plane becomes your friend, when you befriend uncertainty, love is what arises. And it's literally a resource, taking that word of resource, meaning again and again, source meaning it's the source of all sorts of stuff, good stuff. You can return to this source, resource. And then when people develop the resource, and this gets back to your original point, this is the longest response to a short question, that when you do this in community, like if you had your community do this, Lorenz, what happens is people who are doing the wheel of awareness practice from their individual body, who then either share it in the practice together or share the results of it, it's amazing the synergy that arises when people start communicating with one another and interacting with each other from the hub rather than from the rim.
Mm. What 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 would you say the relational dimension of that is, as far as attunement, as far as me feeling you, or having an embodied capacity to sense and feel what is present for you? Like, how does that tie into this concept of the plane of the possibility, and the way that nodes in that plane somehow might affect each other or support each other?
Yeah, exactly. Well, part of it is this, a lot of laughter comes in, a lot of playfulness and laughter and joining, I think what happens is, I'm an acronym addict. So here's an acronym, part. When you get to the plane of possibility, the P of the acronym part is presence. You drop into this state of openness, this open awareness of the hub, which I think as a metaphor correlates with what I think is the mechanism of the plane of possibility and the source of open awareness. So then you tap in. So the P of presence is you are really there. You don't have to do anything. You're just being. Now, that by itself is great, but the A of part is you attune. And what that means is you take your attention, which is different from awareness. Attention is that process which directs energy flow. Some energy is in pure energy, like blah, 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 blah. Some energy, like if I say good afternoon, Lorenz, is information. So energy flow includes both pure energy and the symbolic formation of energy, which we call information. Anyway, so when you're directing your attention to the inward experience of the person you're attuning to, or even with mindfulness, it's attuning to your inner life. But let's stay with the relational, interpersonal relationship. That's the attunement. No, so some people could be just attending to physically what's going on or what's happening in the environment, and they wouldn't be attuning. So they could be present, but not attuning. So it's both presence and attunement.
Can you
But
wait,
then
I just want to pause it for a second because I feel like that's such a subtle but key distinction. Can you just speak a little more about that distinction between presence and attunement?
yeah, I mean, presence is a state of openness, which is really essential, but by itself not enough. So what's it called? There's a phrase for that. I can't think what the phrase is. It's necessary but not sufficient. I think that's the way people say it. You need it, but it's not enough by itself. What I mean is that for a relationship to really thrive, you need, let's say this person A and person B, and let's say B is, suffering with something. Well, I, yes, need to show up and be there. That's fine. But I could be just open and be there, but not be that focusing of my attention on the actual experience of the person. I might be seeing their body. I might be making sure they have water to drink and all that stuff. And that's cool. That's great. But the attunement would be something as simple as, wow, this must be hard for you. Or, there's a study of general practitioners doing this with people with a common cold. So some just, they're there and they say, here, take an aspirin, drink plenty of fluids, call me tomorrow. The other subset of the study, they say they do the same things, but they also say, wow, you're a graduate student, this is May, you're taking final exams, this must be so frustrating for you. So the attunement is a way where I'm sensing into your inner experience. I mean, I call it mind sight. So you're looking at the inner mental life of the person B, if you're person A. So that's attunement. But that's a really, really crucial part. But the R of the part that we play to promote healthy relationships is resonating. So now I'm going to feel your frustration if you're a graduate student having a cold, but I don't have to become you. Or if I'm a parent and a kid falls down and skins their knee and they're screaming in pain, I don't have to fall down and scream in pain. But I can understand, unlike some parents who just say, get up. I mean, the worst would be you're not even present. You ignore your kid falling down. But just presence would be just get up. But if you're attuned to your kid's pain, you might say, oh, that must have been so scary to fall off your tricycle. That's attunement. So resonating is, wow, I can feel my kids really upset having skinned their knee and they just got this exciting tricycle in their exuberance. They hit a rock and flipped over and wow, that was scary. I can feel that fear. But the feeling of fear I have doesn't incapacitate me like my kid is incapacitated right now. So I can resonate, but just like strings on a guitar, when they influence each other, they don't become each other.
Mm,
So that's where resonance is different from mirroring, right?
mm,
So presence, attunement, resonance means the other person can sense that I feel them. So they have the experience, person B, of feeling felt, right?
mm,
So that's huge. Then that's where you feel a we in the resonance.
mm. What was the
But the
original
two
acronym again? Was it PAR or
part,
PART?
PART.
PRT, okay. And the T?
Yeah. What's the part we play? The T is trust.
Mm. That
This
all those
feeling of
elements create trust, it feels
they
like.
create trust. Exactly. PAR creates T.
Mm,
Exactly. And that's the trust you want to create. So the presence is you show up and you're open to whatever arises. Attunement is you focus your attention on the inner experience of the other person. And that shows you're interested in them. That's cool. But the feeling felt comes with the R, the resonance. So now I see you're showing up, the P. I see you're interested, the A. I feel felt by you, the R. And now there's this incredible feeling of trust that gets built into the security I feel in my relationship with you if I'm person B and you're A. So, this way of doing it is made so accessible with practices like the wheel or whatever other practice you might do that access you to this hub, which is a metaphor for the plane of possibility. Because what that does is, no matter what the suffering is of the person in front of you, and we're about to face a lot of suffering in the years ahead for our human family. So what we want to do is develop the resilience that comes when you can access, in a transformational learning kind of way, this capacity to be present, attuned, and resonate so that you develop trust, whatever the suffering is. Because if we don't develop that, we're either going to run from the suffering, or we're going to see it but kind of deny it, or we're going to feel so flooded by it, we're going to say, oh, I don't believe you, which leads to denial or fleeing. It's too much. I'm overwhelmed. I can't stand it. I don't want to think about this. So amazingly, the resource of the plane of possibility that you can get from doing all sorts of practices, but one of the many, many you could do, is the wheel of awareness. And what's so interesting and concrete about it is, you kind of see in this simple diagram, the rim are all the plateaus and peaks of our life. The hub is the plane of possibility. That's your resource. For some people, it's the generator of diversity, the God. It's the sea of potential. It's this formless source of all form. And when that becomes something you feel inside your whole being, then when you're approaching suffering, you take a deep breath. Yes, it could be easily overwhelming, but whatever it is we're facing, the human catastrophes that human beings are created, or the environmental catastrophes, what we've done to nature, or all the unfortunate myriad ways we suffer, then you are a source of resilience, because you can play your part, presence, attunement, resonance, and develop trust in whomever will be privileged to be connected to you as they go through their journey of traveling this life of ours.
Hmm. Do you think these qualities, like the things that we're talking about, this um, hub centered presence, the presence, attuning, resonance, trust, do you think these qualities have a place in, say, more general learning? The way that uh, adults might learn about marketing or permaculture or whatever. That there could be an invitation for this kind of way of being together.
Yeah, I do. I mean, people in all sorts of different walks of life, whether they're talking about their parenting or being teachers or therapists or working in different areas of the environment, or social justice, or just working in any sphere, in business, have found this to be extremely helpful because of exactly what you're inferring, that when you have this transformational learning of coming from the hub, I call it living from the plane of possibility. And notice the phrase, it's not living in the plane of possibility. It's not like you have to go to a cave and disappear and I'm just going to bliss out in the hub. No, it's when you can have this resource available to you, whatever your profession is, whatever your role is in your interpersonal relationships, it's a totally different way to live. Instead of being lost in the illusion of certainty, there's a wonderful artist named Rashid, and she has a quote in the entry to the Brooklyn Public Library, and it says something like, there's a paraphrase: having discovered the flimsy fantasy of certainty, I decided to wander. So that flimsy fantasy of certainty phrase is so useful for saying so much of our life is flitting around because we want some kind of certainty, when in fact it's a flimsy fantasy, meaning, it's a longing, a fantasy that's never going to happen. So part of that is moving away from the plane of possibility and up into these plateaus of belief and these thoughts and strong opinions about this or that. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a conviction about something and go try to create a better world, but we want to come from this place of love and openness, which is the plane of possibility. And what's so interesting to me as a scientist and clinician, and also as a dad and a husband and stuff like that, is this stuff we're talking about is useful in everyday life. So this is not some kind of rarefied let me go take a retreat and just think about the philosophy of living. This is a way of living every day.
Hmm. And I guess just one final question around that. Um, in my experience, this is not a one-time thing. This isn't something that you have this insight, epiphany, major transformation, and that's it. It's, at least for me, it's an everyday practice, and I wonder what the living of it is like for you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I do the wheel every day. If something happens and I'm busy getting up early in the morning, maybe I'll do it on the journey, but I try to do it every day. And what that does is it kind of strengthens the identity lens to be able to widen it out. It also strengthens, I don't know exactly the word you would use for this, but the capacity, because we live in bodies, not to have the glare of day vision that the Newtonian realms body that we live in, because we do live in a body. If you're hearing Lorenz and me speak, then you likely live in a body. You know, you may be AI, but welcome to this embodiment discussion. So you're living in a body. So that means you're living in the Newtonian realm for sure. And you keep on getting told this, social media, all the things we're told about how to live a meaningful life in these bodies. Often those are Newtonian statements. So just like brushing your teeth, you do eat food and then you need to brush your teeth and floss. This is kind of like a mental floss where you're getting the Newtonian messages of separation and across time and space, loosened out from the tartar that they create in the hardening at your gums, so that you want to have mental hygiene, just like you want to have dental hygiene. So you brush your teeth every day. Most people brush their teeth every day. This is exactly the same. It's mental floss, and accessing the hub is basically clearing out the tartar so that you go, oh, I see. Whatever the Newtonian challenges are, this is what I'm going to do. And I have a dear friend named Joanna Macy, and she's one of our leaders. She's almost 95, and she was one of our leaders main leaders in the environmental protection world and social justice and all sorts of things. Anyway, she told me the other day, that a lot of the people who come to her as she's their mentor, are burning out to degrees she's never seen before. And what I told Joanna, which is just I'll say here, is that if people are on automatic pilot, even as activists, and are seeing the growing issues that arise as threats, which is understandable that we all would, the body we live in has an evolutionary history of creating a threat state, fighting, fleeing, freezing, fainting, or even fawning, and these F's of the threat state are not sustainable over time. You will burn out. It's the cause of burnout. So I said to Joanna, I said, what I suggest that she might consider doing in her beautiful work on grief and developing active hope, she has that whole thing, but this just adds a neurophysiology to it, is to invite them to shift from a threat state to a challenge mindset. Now, a challenge mindset says, this thing that's happening, yes, it's an issue I want to deal with, but I can think of it as a dance partner. And so when I wake up in the morning, rather than saying, what's the threat of the day? It's going to kill me and kill everybody I love and kill the whole world. Instead, you say, what's the challenge today? What's the music of today? What's the dance where I take on this challenge as a dance partner and I dance with it? And that challenge state of how are we going to do this dance together is a completely different neurophysiological state of being than the threat state. So for me, the wheel of awareness helps me to access this resource where other possibilities are going to come up from that plane. And that for me, the word hope is very much related to love in the sense that it's about our connection. In this sense, I think hope is being able to connect to options that in your actualized world of those peaks and even the filters of the plateaus, you don't see any other ways out, So you feel hopeless and helpless. But when you develop this access to the plane of possibility, you realize, wow, there are all sorts of options available to work with these challenges and dance with them. And so that resource of the plane of possibility is the source of hope as well as love. And so it's that kind of energy that comes to you when you do a practice of mental hygiene like the wheel of awareness.
Hmm. Thank you, Dan, for that reflection, which I deeply resonate with myself as far as the burnout question. I have a 2.5 hour practice that I go through every day that gives me that mental hygiene. And I was just thinking about this today, that if I didn't have that, I would 100% be destroyed by burnout because just of the
Yeah,
demands of my work. So I really appreciate that reference to the way that practice is, allows you to have this mental hygiene that invites a different relationship to whatever you might be dealing with that makes an enormous difference.
totally.
Um,
Great. Well,
yeah.
I'm glad you have that practice. And, you know, if people can learn from the 2.5 hours or the wheel is 25 minutes, but whatever the practice is that works, um, maybe it's just a 10-minute walk outside or whatever it is, making sure you begin with that
Hmm.
way of developing that kind of resource.
And I will say about the wheel, my practice is heavily informed by the Vipassana tradition. And when I encountered your wheel for the first time, which is just a couple of months ago, I actually found that it was incredibly parallel. It was basically the same thing, but just explained in a different way. And it actually opened up my own practice for me in a deeper way. It somehow crystallized the deeper understanding of the process with which I was working with. So I really appreciate that a lot.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah. When I started teaching with Jack Cornfield and, I had developed the wheel just as a therapeutic intervention in the 90s before I knew about mindfulness meditation. Then Jack and I met and then we started teaching together. And he said, "Oh, yeah, this is a mindfulness practice." I said, "Oh, that's cool." But it didn't start that way. It started to be an integration, literally
Mm,
differentiating and linking the elements of consciousness um, for therapeutic benefits of my patients. And so he said it was a mindfulness practice. I said, "That's great. Okay,
mm,
whatever. That's good." So I was so when we teach together, it's so funny. I mean, it's literally hilarious because when you do this conciliant approach, um, like for example, looking at these emergent properties of the mind and all that stuff, it is so conciliant with, let's say, Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching from the Zen
mm,
tradition, or His Holiness the Dalai Lama's teaching from the Tibetan tradition, or other folks here in the Hindu tradition, and all sorts of traditions. There's a common ground. So I just think that's so cool that we could find a bridge that links us all,
mm,
across all sorts of disciplines.
So cool. Dan, thank you so much for your time for this deep, deep geek out journey into the science, to the science of what we're talking about. It's mind blowing. I really, really appreciate it and really
Good.
grateful.
Well, an
Uh,
honor to be here with you, Lorenz, and look forward to future conversations.
yes, looking forward to laughing more in the future as
That's
well.
right.
Thank you.